There is a specific moment. And if you have ever bought a new phone, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Where a device you loved yesterday suddenly feels like garbage, not because it broke, not because it stopped working, but because someone on a stage in California told you something newer existed. That moment is not an accident. It was engineered, tested, refined, and deployed against you, with the same precision a pharmaceutical company uses to design a drug that keeps you coming back. And the worst part? You paid for the privilege of being manipulated. You handed over $1,000, smiled, and called it an upgrade. Let's go back. 1984. Apple launches the Macintosh with that now legendary Super Bowl commercial, the one with the woman throwing a hammer at a giant screen. The message was clear: technology is liberation. The personal computer is going to free you from conformity, from corporate control, from the gray mass of people who all think the same. And for a moment, that was actually true. Computers in the early 80s were genuinely transformative. If you got your hands on an Apple II or an IBM PC in that era, your life changed in measurable, concrete ways. You could write and edit documents without retyping entire pages. You could run calculations that would have taken hours by hand in seconds. The gap between having the technology and not having it was enormous, and upgrading made sense because each generation of hardware genuinely unlocked things you could not do before. The culture of the 80s in America was perfectly calibrated to receive this message. Consumerism was not just accepted, it was patriotic. On Reagan's America was a culture of aspiration, of visible success, of the belief that buying the right things meant you were becoming the right kind of person. The yuppie, young urban professional, became a cultural archetype, and the personal computer sat right at the center of that identity. Owning a Macintosh in 1984 was not just a purchasing decision, it was a statement about who you were and where you were headed. Tech companies understood this early, and they have never let go of it. They realized that if a device can become part of your identity, the upgrade is not just about the hardware anymore. It is about the self-image. And threatening someone's self-image is a far more powerful sales tool than any spec sheet. By the 90s, the personal computing industry was doubling in power roughly every 2 years, not something Gordon Moore had predicted back in 1965. And in those early decades, Moore's law made upgrade cycles genuinely rational. The jump from a 486 processor to a Pentium was not marginal. It was the difference between a machine that could run modern software and one that could not. The difference between a 28.8 kilobit modem and a 56 kilobit modem was not subtle. You felt it. Programs that used to take minutes to load now opened in seconds. Games that ran at slideshow speeds suddenly played the way they were meant to. The culture around tech in the 90s reflected this reality. Computer magazines were thick as phone books, filled with benchmarks and comparisons and buyer's guides because readers actually needed to know what was worth buying. The decisions mattered because the differences were real. But something started shifting in the late 90s and accelerated hard into the 2000s. Processing power kept growing, but the tasks most people needed computers for stopped growing with it. By the time a mid-range PC could play music, browse the web, manage photos, and run a word processor without breaking a sweat, the hardware had quietly outpaced the needs of the average user. The industry had a problem. The product was good enough. And good enough is the enemy of a business model built on replacement cycles. So the solution, developed gradually and then all at once, was to move the competition from performance to perception. If you cannot make the new thing dramatically more capable, you make the old thing feel dramatically less acceptable. Apple cracked this code better than anyone. Like the iPod launched in 2001 into a world where portable music players already existed. The Rio P MP300 had been out since 1998. But Apple did not just sell a music player, they sold a lifestyle object, a piece of minimalist sculpture that happened to play music, and they engineered the entire experience. The interface, the packaging, the retail environment, the advertising, around the idea that owning one made you a certain kind of person. Then they released a new one every year, not because the old one stopped playing music, but because the annual release trained you to feel the calendar passing, to feel time making your device older. The iPod mini replaced the iPod. The iPod Nano replaced the Mini. The Nano got thinner, then got colors, then got a camera, then disappeared entirely when the iPhone made the whole category irrelevant. Owners of perfectly functional devices were systematically made to feel out of step, not by the device failing, but by the drumbeat of newness that Apple orchestrated with the precision of a film studio releasing sequels. Each announcement was its own event, its own cultural moment, its own quiet indictment of whatever you were currently holding in your hand. This is the foundation the modern upgrade illusion is built on, not deception in the legal sense, not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. Just an extremely well-funded, deeply researched, continuously refined system for making you feel like what you have is never quite enough, applied to a population that was already primed by decades of consumer culture to believe that the newest version of anything is the best version of anything. The machine was built slowly, piece by piece, but by the time most people noticed it running, they were already inside it. Here is something that almost nobody talks about when the conversation turns to planned obsolescence. The people making these decisions are not sitting in boardrooms cackling about tricking the public. The reality is more uncomfortable than that. The engineers who design the software updates that slow your older phone down are genuinely trying to solve a real problem: aging batteries that can cause unexpected shutdowns. The product managers who schedule annual releases are responding to real shareholder pressure for growth in a market that has reached saturation. The marketers who craft the language that makes your 2-year-old device sound antiquated are working within systems that reward engagement and conversion. The machine does not need villains to run. It just needs incentives, and the incentives are perfectly aligned to produce this exact outcome. You, standing in a line, paying for something you do not actually need, feeling completely rational about it. The 2007 iPhone launch is the clearest case study in how this system went from a pattern to a paradigm. Steve Jobs walked onto a stage and introduced 3 things: a widescreen iPod, a revolutionary phone, and a breakthrough internet device, and then revealed they were all one product. The audience lost their minds, and they had reason too. The original iPhone was genuinely different from anything that had existed before. The touch interface, the visual voicemail, the way the browser rendered actual desktop websites instead of stripped-down mobile versions. These were real innovations that real people could feel in daily use. Like BlackBerry owners switched and felt the difference immediately. Nokia users who made the jump understood within days why the landscape had shifted. The first iPhone deserved its reception because it earned it through capability. What happened over the next 18 years is where the story turns. Each successive iPhone generation delivered less and less in terms of life-changing new capability, while the marketing machinery around each release grew larger and more sophisticated. The iPhone 3G brought real GPS and the App Store, transformative. The iPhone 4 brought a Retina display that genuinely looked different from anything before it. You could see the improvement with your eyes. The iPhone 5 brought a larger screen at a time when larger screens felt meaningfully better. People switched and noticed. But by the time the industry reached the iPhone 6 era and beyond, the gains became increasingly difficult to perceive outside of controlled benchmark environments. The cameras got better in ways that mattered mostly to photographers who were already buying dedicated cameras. The processors got faster in ways that mattered mostly to developers running computational workloads. The screens got brighter in ways that mattered mostly in direct midday sunlight. And yet the cultural moment around each release grew louder, not quieter. Lines outside stores got longer, pre-order servers crashed under demand. The gap between the real-world improvement and the cultural intensity of the launch event widened every single year, and the industry made up the difference with increasingly theatrical presentations, celebrity endorsements, and a review ecosystem that was structurally incentivized to find significance in marginal gains. The American consumer culture of the 2010s was the perfect host for this dynamic to run wild in. Social media had turned personal objects into public statements in a way that had no real precedent. Your phone was visible in every photo you posted, every video call you took, every coffee shop table where it sat face up next to your latte. Holding a 2-year-old phone in 2015 carried a faint social signal that holding a 2-year-old phone in 2005 simply did not. The device had become a status object in a world where status was being performed publicly and constantly for the first time in human history. Instagram launched in 2010, Snapchat in 2011. The front-facing camera, which Apple added to the iPhone 4 in 2010 almost as an afterthought, became within 5 years one of the most commercially significant pieces of hardware ever put into a consumer device. Not because it improved your ability to communicate, but because it let you perform your life for an audience. And performing your life for an audience created constant pressure to have the device that made that performance look best. The financing mechanisms that spread through the industry in the mid-2000s are the part of this story that almost never gets examined closely enough. AT&T, Verizon, and Apple itself introduced installment plans and upgrade programs that broke the psychological barrier of the four-figure price tag. If a $1,000 phone costs you $40-something a month, it stops feeling like a $1,000 decision. It starts feeling like a subscription, a utility, something closer in mental category to your Netflix bill than to a major purchase. This was not accidental. The financing structures were designed specifically to lower the activation energy of the upgrade decision, to take the financial reality of what you were spending and distribute it across time until it became invisible. The result is that most Americans now have no accurate sense of what they actually spend on personal technology annually, because the costs are disaggregated across multiple monthly charges, trade-in credits that feel like discounts, and accessory purchases that never feel like part of the same category. Meanwhile, the devices being traded in had plenty of life left. A 2019 study from the Mobile Ecosystem Forum found that the average smartphone trade-in happens with the device still fully functional, capable of running current software, with no hardware defects. People were not trading in broken phones. They were trading in phones that felt old, felt slow, felt like last year, because the culture and the marketing and the financing and the annual keynote had all conspired to redefine good enough upward at a pace that the actual technology improvements could not honestly justify. The phone you traded in did not decline. Your tolerance for it declined, and that tolerance was carefully managed downward by people whose revenue depended on it. Every dollar you spent on an upgrade you did not need is a dollar that compounded in someone else's portfolio instead of yours. So what do you actually do with this information? Because knowing that a system is designed to extract money from you is one thing. Changing your behavior inside that system is another. And I want to be honest with you here. This is not about becoming some kind of anti-tech minimalist who refuses to buy anything. That is not a realistic prescription, and it is not a particularly useful one. Technology is genuinely good. Smartphones are extraordinary tools. The question is not whether to use them. The question is whether the schedule you replace them on is yours or theirs. Start with a number. Write down what you have spent on personal technology in the last 5 years. Phones, laptops, tablets, earbuds, smartwatches, cases, chargers, cables, streaming sticks, smart speakers. Add it all up. Most people who do this exercise for the first time come out somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000 and feel genuinely surprised by the total. Because each individual purchase felt reasonable at the time. The financing spread the pain. The trade-in credits made the replacements feel cheaper than they were. The accessories felt like small decisions, but the sum is real, and it compounds. The money you spent upgrading to a phone that was 3% faster in 2021 is not just the price of that phone. It is everything that money could have become if you had kept the phone you already had. The practical alternative is not complicated, but it requires resisting a cultural current that is running against you. Keep your devices until they genuinely cannot perform the tasks you actually use them for. Not the tasks the marketing suggests you should want to use them for. The tasks you actually use them for every day. When performance degrades, replace the battery before you replace the device. A battery replacement on an iPhone costs under $100 and can restore 2 to 3 years of useful life to a phone that felt like it was dying. If you do need to replace a device, look at certified refurbished options from 2 generations back before you look at anything new. A flagship phone from 2 years ago running current software handles email, social media, navigation, photography, and streaming video at a level that is functionally indistinguishable from anything released last September, and it costs 40 to 50% less. The laptop situation is even clearer because laptop hardware improvement curves flattened out even faster than phone curves. A MacBook Pro from 2019 with a fresh battery and a clean operating system handles writing, web browsing, and video calls, photo editing, and most productivity software without strain. The machine did not get worse. The marketing got louder. If your laptop is running slowly, there is a high probability that the solution is deleting files, clearing cache, closing background processes, and possibly adding RAM or replacing the drive. Interventions that cost a fraction of replacement and restore performance you thought was gone. The tech industry would prefer you did not know this, because knowing it breaks the replacement cycle they depend on. There is a broader thing worth sitting with here, and it goes beyond personal finance. The upgrade illusion is not just a consumer behavior pattern, it is a significant driver of one of the fastest growing environmental problems on the planet. When the United Nations Environment Program has documented that e-waste is now the world's fastest growing solid waste stream. The minerals required to manufacture a single smartphone, lithium, cobalt, coltan, rare earth elements, come from mining operations that carry serious environmental and human cost. The carbon footprint of manufacturing a new phone is roughly equivalent to the emissions from using that phone for an entire decade. This means that every time you upgrade a functioning device, the environmental decision is almost always to keep what you have. The person still using a 4-year-old phone is not behind. They are, on every metric that matters beyond social signaling, making a more rational and more responsible choice. The cultural permission to resist the upgrade cycle is growing, slowly, but it is real. The right to repair movement has won legislative victories in multiple U.S. states. The European Union has passed regulations requiring manufacturers to make spare parts available and support devices with software updates for longer minimum periods. Consumer advocates have pushed back against the legal and technical barriers manufacturers built around independent repair. None of this happened because companies decided to be generous. It happened because enough people recognized the extraction mechanism and pushed against it. You are not alone in noticing that something is off about a world where a 2-year-old phone feels embarrassing and a 10-year-old car feels normal. Look, if you made it here, you are already the kind of person who thinks about this stuff more carefully than most. And I genuinely want to know what your experience has been. Have you ever upgraded a device and felt that immediate hollow realization that nothing actually changed? Have you ever held on to something longer than everyone around you told you to and been quietly glad you did? Drop it in the comments. Not as a performance, not to be part of a debate, but because those stories are actually useful. They are real data against the marketing. They are proof that the alternative works, and hearing them from someone who actually lived it lands differently than any statistic I can put on screen. Your experience matters here, and it matters to the people watching this who are on the edge of a decision right now. If this changed something in how you see the next announcement, the next keynote, and the next time someone asks what phone you have, subscribe. Not because channels need subscribers to feel validated, but because the next video is going to go somewhere this one did not have time to go. There is a whole chapter of this story about the software subscription model, about how the industry pivoted when hardware replacement cycles slowed down, and about what that means for what you are paying every month right now without thinking about it. You are going to want to be here for that one. See you then.